So Mark Carney said something this week that made headlines everywhere. The problem is, most of the coverage just stopped at that quote and missed what it actually means.
He didn't just say that Canada needs new trading partners. He said that Canada's reliance on the United States has gone from being a strength to a weakness. When he says that, what he really is saying is the old operating system is broken. Canada built a lot of its economy on the assumption that the Americans, even when annoying, were still broadly reliable. But if Washington starts using tariffs, threats, and chaos as policy, then dependence stops being efficient and starts looking reckless.
Yeah, Prime Minister Carney's video mattered because he framed this as structural, not temporary. He pointed to the tariffs hitting autos, steel, and lumber. But the bigger point was that the problem is no longer one bad week or one bad negotiator. The problem is that the United States itself has changed its approach. And Canada is one of the first G7 countries to say this clearly, name it clearly, and already have an architecture in place to replace it.
And Trump's response? Well, he's already used his leverage. The tariffs are in, the rhetoric escalated, CUSMA is heading into review, and instead of waiting, Canada has already started building alternatives without him.
So today, we're going to show you exactly what that new architecture looks like and why Mark Carney said what he said. The China play, the European defense deal Canada's already inside, and why the Arctic became Canada's most powerful strategic position. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's start with what Carney actually said, because it matters more than the headlines. He said, many of our former strengths, based on our close ties to America, have become weaknesses. Weaknesses that we must correct. He's not talking about personalities, and he's not saying the relationship just needs repair. He's saying that what used to make Canada stronger, deep integration, proximity to the world's largest economy, well, that now makes Canada more exposed. And once that exposure shows up in trade, it doesn't stay contained just there.
And that's a completely different kind of diagnosis. If the problem were Trump, well, what'd you do? You just wait him out. 4 years, done, reset. But if the problem is structural, if roughly 75% of Canadian exports flow through a single relationship with a country that can weaponize that access at will, waiting is not a strategy anymore.
And Prime Minister Carney isn't waiting, not in a we should explore options way, but in a contract signed way, deals executed, frameworks activated kind of way. The pace of it is genuinely astonishing.
It really is, which is exactly why that clown Howard Lutnick's response this week is so useful as evidence. The U.S. Commerce Secretary didn't meet Canada's strategy with concern or diplomacy. He mocked it publicly. And that tells you everything about what Washington still thinks the power dynamic is. An empire annoyed that a country has decided to act like one.
When they don't get their way, they act like babies and throw a tantrum.
Yep.
But that mockery looks different when you see what Canada has already put in place. Because the leverage Lutnick assumes that Washington still holds, well, it's diminishing fast.
Now let's be precise about why 2026 is a turning point and not just another difficult year. CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement, is up for review this year. It's actually coming up in June. And every Canadian business, every auto manufacturer, every steel and lumber operation is watching the negotiation that can rewrite its entire cost structure.
And normally, that review is a process. It's standard diplomatic machinery. But this one is happening while the Americans have already imposed tariffs on autos, on steel, and on lumber outside of CUSMA's own protections, which means that this is not a negotiation. It's closer to a renegotiation where the other side walked in with the tools already on the table.
And what you do in that position is you don't negotiate from panic. You negotiate from optionality, where you have options. And here is what Washington expects. That Canada has no real choice, that the economic weight is too heavy, that the alternatives are too thin. Well, that calculation was already wrong when it was made. Just look at the China move.
Yeah, Canada eased tariffs on Chinese EVs for a defined quota in exchange for improved access for Canadian canola and relief on agricultural exports. Now, that's not just a giveaway, that is trade. That is Canada using exactly the tools that every serious trading nation uses. for once.
And before this gets framed as replacing one dependence for another, because we hear that argument all the time, especially from the US, that is not what optionality means. You're not swapping Washington for Beijing. You're ensuring that no single relationship can cut off your air supply the way this current one can. That's not ideology, that is geometry, people. And the geometry is shifting.
Now, let's talk about Europe, because this is where the architecture gets real, and most political commentary hasn't caught up with how far along it already is.
Yeah. Two things happened recently that belong in the same sentence and where they are. First, the EU built the Anti-Coercion instrument after years of pressure from both China and the United States. That is a legal framework built inside the European Union specifically designed to respond when a major power uses trade access or economic relationships as a political weapon. It's not a statement, it's a binding enforcement mechanism with teeth. And second, and this is the one that should be the headline, Canada has signed an agreement to participate in SAFE, the Security Action for Europe. We've talked about this in other videos. It's a 150 billion euro joint military procurement agreement, the largest European defense buildup since the end of the Cold War, and nobody's really talking about it.
And Canada is already part of it, the only non-EU country involved. We're not just in discussions, it's not exploratory talks. We've signed, sealed, and delivered. Canada's defense manufacturers, Canada's shipbuilders, Canada's aerospace firms, well, they can now bid and win contracts inside of Europe's entire rearmament program. Now that's Canadian workers, Canadian supply chains, embedded in a 150 billion euro structure.
And Europe opened that door to Canada specifically. Not out of sentiment because they just liked us, but because Canada is stable, predictable, and not threatening to annex anyone's territory in 2026. That combination is genuinely really rare right now, and rare things become very valuable very quickly.
So when Canada has defense contract embedded inside 27 European governments, the economic weight shifts. Washington cannot tariff its way out of a procurement framework signed by a sovereign multilateral bloc. There is no executive order that can reverse any of this.
So the threat that Canada has no options, that threat is already over and out the window. Canada has built the options, and some of them are now permanent.
But there is a third dimension here that belongs alongside trade and defense, and it is the one that is the hardest to walk back once it's in place: the Arctic.
Yes, NATO launched its Arctic Sentry framework in February of this year. That's a coordinated military posture across the entire northern flank. Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Canada, all aligned under a single strategic umbrella. And Canada's Operation Nanook, which has been running as our primary northern sovereignty operation for years, well, it's now formally integrated into that NATO framework.
Which means Arctic security for Canada is no longer a bilateral conversation with Washington. It is a multilateral commitment with 11 democratic nations that have already made their own calculation. American reliability is not something that they can assume. So Canada is now the anchor, and that explains why we have set record numbers of recruitments here in Canada just last month.
And that matters more than almost any trade figure, because the Arctic is not peripheral geography, not just on the outskirts. The shipping routes opening across the top of the world are strategic infrastructure. The resource deposits underneath are strategic assets. Russia and China are both actively positioning there. This is the defining geography of the next 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, so when Trump calls Greenland a poorly run piece of ice, while running a country where the federal minimum wage has not moved since 2009, what he is revealing is that he doesn't understand what is actually being contested up there. Every Nordic government, every serious NATO planner hears that and draws the same conclusion. America, it's not managing this moment. Canada and our NATO allies are.
And when you are the countries that NATO's Arctic framework runs through, when you're inside a 150 billion euro SAFE program, when the anti-coercion instrument has been created alongside you as a de facto economic partner, well, the answer to what leverage does Washington still have? Well, it gets shorter every single month. So let's pull this all together. Prime Minister Carney's argument is not that Trump is a problem that Canada needs to manage. His argument is that the United States itself has changed its relationship with the world, and Canada's job now is to build a position that can withstand that change permanently, not wait for a friendlier administration to correct it. Isaac Brock understood something foundational about this country, and Carney quoted him in his video. Canada has always had to build its resilience under direct pressure from the South. What is different now is that the response isn't defensive, it's architectural. And Carney clearly understands that architectural changes are not reversed.
So here's what we want to know from you. The CUSMA review is happening this year, and Prime Minister Carney has a majority until 2029. Do you think that the architecture Canada has already built is strong enough to hold firm when Washington pushes hard on that review?
And what move do you want to see Carney make next that he hasn't made yet?
Drop your thoughts in the comments because we read every one of them.
And if this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening right now in the world, share it, like it, and subscribe to this channel. There are a lot of people trying to make sense of this moment, and we're here every single day doing it for you.
And when you leave your comment, check out the pinned comment for all the links to the fun stuff like the A-Team, the Facebook group, and our Substack. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody.
Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.